Thanks for the download. Before we start, it would be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from, as this helps me know how we're doing and brings it to the attention of potential listeners. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep production costs to the minimum. My guest today is Lilian van Mourik, who's dialing in all the way from Holland, and I've talked with her about the recovery of Stirling bomber BK716 and its 7 crew members as part of the remarkable Dutch programme for World War II aircraft recoveries. This was set up in 2019 and aims to recover 30 aircraft over the next decade. We also discussed Dutch wartime remembrance culture, the morality of area bombing, the deprivations of the hunger winter, and how the sacrifices made in World War II are relevant today. Keep an ear out for our competition question and a chance to win a book about BK716 and also a few beers that were brewed to commemorate the crew. Let's crack on. Thank you for coming to the podcast, Lilian. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and the Dutch National Programme for World War II aircraft recoveries, which was set up in 2019 and aims to recover 30 aircraft over the next decade?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I live in Almere, which is a city pretty close to Amsterdam, about 20 kilometers. And it's located on a so-called new land, which means that this part of the country, this area, is reclaimed land and only exists since the 60s, and Almere has been founded in the 70s. So we have a very short history. It used to be former sea, and after that it's been one big lake. So I also work at the city of Almere, where I run different kind of projects. And one of the projects I've done is the recovery of a British bomber from the Second World War in one of the lakes close by. And that's been part of the Dutch aircraft recovery program. And that's how I gotten involved in the program too. So for the time being, I'm also working at our national government to see if we can increase the social impact of the national program in passing on the story. So the program was set up especially for wishes for the families to make a recovery and to give them kind of closure. So the program fully focused on aircraft with missing airmen. So any other aircraft we still have wreckages too, but they're outside of the national program. So we're doing that for both German as for Allied aircraft, because we think it's important that on both sides their families, they have to miss someone. And especially if someone's missing, you don't know what happened. So we hope you don't get every answer, but perhaps it's kind of closure. And in the end, it will lead to proper burial. So the families also have a place to go. So that's very important. And after the war, about 5,500 aircraft came down in the Netherlands, which is a lot. We're not very big. Some came down in the North Sea, but a lot came down in the land and in the water. So after the war, there were a lot of wreckages who were kind of in the way of rebuilding our country. So on land, it was more easy to just scrap it away, but it was also in the big lakes where there were still fishermen and all the fishing nets were caught in the wreckage parts. And so where the transport, which needs to go through the rivers and through the lakes. So our government did a big sort of cleaning sweep of picking up all the parts. It wasn't focused on recovering a full aircraft or finding missing airmen. It was just to clean up and, well, move on, leave the war behind us. So when they found body remains, they got a burial, but the focus was just to clean it up. And after that, so in the early 50s, it was kind of unknown who does a recovery or not. So there were a lot of scrap dealers who picked up parts and sold them on whatever market. There was a shortage of metal, but also aluminium, stuff like that. So in the 60s, the part where I live, which is reclaimed land, they pumped dry a certain part of the lake, and a lot of wreckages surfaced from that. So they were still there in the soil. And then I need to do recovery too. And then I said, okay, isn't it weird that it's a bit of a Wild West? Everybody's just picking up parts, selling it. There's not really control over it. And that's when they established a salvage team, which is part of the MOD. And it's run by a salvage officer that's part of the Air Force. And actually that team still exists today. It's part of the aircraft recovery program. Of course, a lot of techniques and things have all changed. But that's just how it works. So before the program was set up, as a municipality, you decide if you're going to do recovery or not. And you had to pay 30% of the cost themselves, which is quite difficult for a municipality to do. Because, for example, if you have a recovery that's going to cost you €1 million and you have to cover up €300,000, that's just not possible, especially not the smaller municipalities. So that led to all kinds of questions. How can we explain that to families? Okay, you've crashed down in one municipality and don't have enough money. But if you would have crashed down in the other, the recovery might have taken place. So that led to all kinds of questions in Parliament and eventually led to a motion to say, okay, we want to do recovery and we want to fund the municipalities 100% by the national government. So the financial issue may never be the reason to make a decision not to recover. So it can be technical, can be all kinds of reasons, but not a financial one.
Do you get any cash help from, like, the German government, the British government, to recover the bodies of their servicemen?
No. This is fully paid by the Dutch government, except for the burial. That's all organized by the countries where the people are, where the airmen are from. So that's a different. No, it's fully paid for by the Dutch. I think later in the podcast I can explain what we're doing. But the full focus was now, okay, if we're going to do that and set up a program, why not try to find more aircraft? Because we were very reactive. If a family made a request, the municipality was going to look into it. And then if it was possible, if there was money, it would take place or else not. But if we're setting up a program, we might as well be more proactive as a national government to see where are the still aircraft where we can expect missing airmen and very feasible and high chance of finding them. So they estimate that about 400 aircraft still have missing airmen in them, but it's not possible to recover all of them. Like the North Sea, we can't do any recoveries there because of the circumstances. Very dangerous to do so, very complicated, and the chance of finding human remains is very, very slim. So we focus on the most, the aircraft who have most chance of finding missing airmen. And that's how we estimate it's going to be around 30 recoveries. And we hope that the families that are now still alive have a more direct relationship to the airmen. So that's why we feel kind of rush. We're going to do it now, or it might be never be going to be done. So that's why it's set up, and it's now running for 4 or 5 years. And we had the 9th recovery recently in last summer.
I think it's very interesting because a lot of people don't know, and I didn't realise until myself recently, that a lot of these body recovery programs are still going on. The Americans are doing a lot of work in the Pacific area from World War II.
Yeah.
The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is doing stuff all over the world to recover British servicemen. And I read an interesting article about after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Germans were given access into the Soviet Union because there was hundreds of thousands of German soldiers killed there. Yeah. And the war in Ukraine's actually stopped a lot of that work going on. And then I read another article whereby Ukrainian soldiers were digging in new defensive positions and were recovering the remains of German soldiers when they were digging trenches. The Second World War might be, 80 odd years in the past, but it's still relevant today, that actions that your community is carrying out, I think.
And maybe it's good to know that in principle, a crash site is considered to be a war grave. So we need to protect that and maintain that. And we make 2 exceptions that we're going to recover anyway. That's out of health and safety issues. Let's say if you're going to build houses and there is an aircraft still in the ground, you might have explosive, but also hazardous substances like asbestos or benzene or stuff like that. So they need to clean that everything. And the other is if it's out of respect towards the families, if they make a special request.
Up to the Falklands War, the dead from British campaigns tended to be buried in the country they died in. But the Falklands War really changed that, and there was 255 servicemen killed in the Falklands War, and families were, I think, for the first time, given the choice to repatriate the bodies. Yeah. That's led to that now, so you had quite a few bodies repatriated from the Falklands. But it's illuminating now that I think that families in the modern age want their relatives brought back. And I think that also ties in with what you guys are doing over there and giving families opportunity to put these people and give them the fitting rest for fighting for the country.
Exactly. And are they also looking for missing airmen now? Has that changed? Or
certainly, I know that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does research all around the world, and quite often annually you'll hear of ceremonies going round. Recently, I think it was last year, there was a couple of bodies recovered in Korea, and they were given a proper burial in Korea.
Yeah.
So it happens all the time, and it's good. I think it's a lot of comfort for the family. In that Korean one, the daughter was 3 months old when her father was killed, and she attended the service over in Korea. BK716 was a British Second World War short Stirling bomber, which crashed in Lake, now I'm going to massacre my Dutch here, Isselmeer?
Yeah.
Is that Isselmeer? Is that how you pronounce it?
Isselmeer. Yeah, you're almost right.
Which is now named Markermeer?
Yes.
Oh, that's not too bad then.
You can blend right in.
And that's in the Netherlands, obviously, and it crashed in 1943 while on a mission after being shot down by a German aircraft. In the autumn of 2020, the municipality of Almere recovered the wreckage, and BK716 had 7 crew members on board, 5 of whom were British and 2 Canadian. Obviously, those human remains were found. So you're the project manager for this. Can you talk us through the project from start to finish, please, Lilian?
Perhaps it's good to have an idea about the crash site, because when a plane comes down, whether it's on land or whether it's in a lake, it's like hitting concrete. So you're never going to recover a full wreckage. It's all wreckage parts, hundreds and hundreds of parts. And that also goes for the remains, because they scatter all over the place. And you're lucky if you can find a whole bone, but usually it's all bone fragments. And they can be as small as like a fingernail. So I think it's important to realize that, and that makes the operation very complicated, because you want to pick out very, very small parts out of a big lake. So that's something to bear in mind. So actually we started with a few dots on a map. There is something in the water. It's an aircraft. And at that time it was identified as a different aircraft, as the BK710. I will share a bit about that later, because that was a mix-up with finding of the families. And the Markermeer is perhaps good to know. It's a former sea, and that also means that the conditions on the water are the same if you will go an open sea, so the weather conditions and wave and stuff. And because it's a former sea and they closed it and turned it into a lake by building all these dikes, it's the kind of weird condition that the waves have no way to go, because all the rivers still flow to the lake, but they can't go anywhere. So the experts always jokingly call it like a bathtub. The waves also come back, and that makes it more difficult if you have equipment and stuff like that on the water. You really need expert contractors to work on that. So every recovery is unique, because you have all kinds of different what you need to sort out. But I think you can break it down in 5 steps. The research, the administrative preparation, the recovery itself, identification of the remains, and at the end, the burial. So research is key. It might be the boring part of the whole recovery, but it is very important to do so. So the better you are prepared, the more successful your recovery is going to be. And if you haven't done it properly, I think you should just let the recovery go too, because you need to know exactly what you're up against. So the Markermeer, because of the strange conditions of the waves coming back and everything, is very, very blurry. So you have a side of only 10 centimeters, and on a good day, it might be 30. So that is not a lot. So you can't see anything. It's not that you can sensor down and see a wreckage part or anything. So that's why you need all kinds of research to sort out how does the aircraft lie. So what we do, or what we have done, that we need to identify the whole area. At the end for BK716, it was 100 meters by 100 meters. That is a huge part to do a recovery. That's how far the wreckage parts have been spread. But you're also going to look how far has it gotten into the soil, because it crashed and it's been laying there for almost 80 years. So it also has sunk deeper, and especially the area where we did the recovery, it's very clayish ground. So the heavier parts have sunk much deeper than the lighter parts. So that's all things you need to sort out with your research. And research is done with detection like ferrous or non-ferrous, where you can spot the metal parts and non-metal parts, but you only see a big map with all the dots on it. But you don't know what part it is because you can't see anything. So you need to have divers, and that's done by our Navy. They dived on the wreckage to find out, so they touched to see how do we think the aircraft lies. Are they aircraft parts? Because we had a huge metal thing, and it turned out to be a big anchor from a ship when it was still at sea. So it was a 3.5 meter anchor and had nothing to do with the aircraft at all. So that's why you need to look that stuff up. There are also volunteer organizations who had found the aircraft years before, I will tell about that later, who also had valid information in coordinates and what they found and what they had discovered. So we added that too. And then the diving research from the Navy, they also make, based on the history, okay, we think it's this and this aircraft. So we know it's on the way to Germany, or it was on its way back, which is very important for explosives, but also fuel tanks, that sort of things. You can never be 100% certain that all the bombs are not in there anymore, because there could have been a malfunction or anything. But you know it's not going to be as much as well if they would have been on their way. And what you do is analyze the soil, all the different kind of layers, so you know a little bit how deep it has sunk, so how deep you need to dig everything out. And then the other part, which is very important in the lake, is it's a very restricted nature area. And with that, we have very strict measurements, probably also in the UK.
Yeah.
So that means you need to make a lot of impact analysis. So brace yourself. It's ecological, so all flora and fauna, what's the effect on every type of bird, fish, amphibian, bats, everything that's down there. And you make all these little tweaks and adjustments in your project plan to make sure that's all preserved. Nitrogen emission is very important. PFAS, you know, all the plastics that still stay there. And you need to do a measurement from the quality of the water and the soil. Because you can't put so it's always contaminated. It's never fully 100% clean. We wish, but it isn't. But you can't put back all the soil when it's more contaminated than when you started. So that's also, so it dominates the project a lot, all the environmental regulations.
You can see why the costs are just mounting up with these things that you have to adhere to, isn't it?
Yeah, and all different kind of opinions, if it's important or not, but it is a situation you have to deal with. There are a lot of regulations. So the next thing you also need to do is to find a detonate location. Just in case if you're going to find big explosives, our bomb squad needs to go there very quickly. They can't drive through the country with all kinds of explosives. If it's smaller things, they usually go to a military base and detonate it there. They put it just in a big sort of lock and then take it with them. But you can never be too sure. So you need to have that too. There has to be a lot of sand. Can't be any pipes and everything in the ground. And then when you've said that, okay, you have to establish that too. And you have to make all sort of agreement with emergency organizations. What if something happens to ambulances or a trauma helicopter? You need to work all that out where it needs to go if anything happens. Of course, you hope it doesn't, but if it does, it would be nice to know what to do. So when you've done all this research, you're actually going to say, okay, we have a sort of final go, no-go moment. We had a go, luckily. And you're also going to determine the MOD, the salvage officer, determines which is the best recovery method based on all the research that's been done. And the biggest question we had, are we going to use a cover dam or not? Well, because of the size of the area, 100 by 100 meters, wasn't feasible to do a cover dam because you're never going to have a wall that's going to hold all the water. So you need to make all these little side walls, and they would have been put right into the recovery, into the wreckage parts. So at the end to say, no, we're going to do it without a cover dam, which is quite complicated because you're going to dig out the soil in the water without pumping any of the water out. So you also make a program of requirements because you need to find a contractor, certified contractor, who's going to support the MOD for the execution of the recovery. You need permits, you need exemptions for all the administrative things that come along with all the regulations. That is very, very long a process that takes at least a half year to get that all in order. And then finally you can really start when you have all that set, because the permits, they might give you a permit, but there's a special criteria. So all the criteria that comes from the permits you need for your project plan. So you can't finish your project plan at the same time. You need to wait which criteria you need to put in. And then together, the MOD, the municipality, and the certified contractor draw up a final project plan, a safety and security plan, and that's pretty much it. And that's a starting point. You're going to do the recovery. So we had a big setback, I think the whole world had, with the COVID situation, because we were going to do the recovery, we're planning to do it on the 3rd of March in 2020. But that went all differently, so we had to reschedule to the end of August. And all the COVID measures were also needed to be added to the safety and security plan. So I don't think, looking back, it was per se the measures that were most tough, but the fact that they constantly changed. Mm. So every week there were new things, and the contractor would need new material. And there wasn't any, because there was a shortage, because the whole world was looking for the same material. So that was very tough. And I think 2 days prior to the recovery, it was unknown if we could continue or not. So that was that was a bit stressful.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So finally, everything was set in motion, and then the recovery can take place. So what they do, they built 2 construction sites, one on land, where you have a sort of dock, where you need to get all the boats, materials, a shed for meetings, stuff like that. And in the end, you're going to store all the wreckage parts there too. And you build one on the water. That's a big work island. It's like a ponton. And then you have the legs that stabilize it in the soil. So the area of the work islands, I thought it was 12 by 20 meters. So what they put on there, well, things for the staff. I mean, you need to eat. There's toilets, there is meeting room for the briefing, stuff like that. But there's also a big sieve, which is like a big grid.
For searching
where you're going to hose off all the wreckage parts. Yeah. And then they have a conveyor belt. I'll just tell how it all works. So that's all put on the work island. And then there is a boat. And on the boat is a big grabber, an excavator, that's going to dig out all the soil, and it's going to, over the 100 meters. And then you, of course, have boats like a ferry, because you need to bring the staff and things back and forth. So before you have that set up, that takes weeks.
It's actually mind-boggling. When you say a recovery program, I think that's why it's important to discuss this, because that is a huge project, what you've described there. And it'd be easy for your municipality just to say, do you know what, it's too much effort, too much cost. So I think it makes... It gives a better understanding of the depth of feeling for the recovery of these aircraft and their crews.
Yeah, because it's not a project you do very often. Most municipalities just do it once. So you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you have no experience on how to do that. So that's also in a decision making. Are we going to do it? Because you're going to put more people on it than you would if it's a standard project. So what they do, they dig out all the soil with the excavator, and it's a GPS coordinated. So they know exactly where they've been. But as you can imagine, if you dig out a hole on the beach, all the sand just on the side just slides back in. That also happens in the water, perhaps even more. So they need to extend the area a little bit to make sure and they have to go layer by layer. So you can't just dig out as deep as you want to go, but you need to put layer by layer. So that takes time. And because of all the research, they know, okay, we expect to find bigger parts in that area, and they're brought up by the grabber, but they put a chain on the end of the grabber, and the divers from the Navy put it on the bigger parts like an engine block or a propeller, and then they pull that all out. And after that, they're going for the smaller parts, and that's all the soil that's putting on a sieve, and then it's hosed off. And we had 2 sieves, and the smallest was 8 millimeters, so that's very small, tiny grid. And after that, all that's left on the sieve is put on a conveyor belt, and the MOD recovery team, which consists about 6 people, are going to handpick all the parts. So that goes for bone fragments and personal belongings. That go with the identification team. That goes for all wreckage parts. But also there are also other archaeological findings. Because we had such a history of shipwrecks too, There's a lot of material that doesn't belong to the aircraft. There's radiation material and there's asbestos, which all needs to be separated. And in the end, there's also rubbish of people who've thrown stuff overboard. So that all needs to be sorted out. And after that, well, it took about 5 weeks to finish the whole recovery because it's very time consuming, all the smaller parts to sort them all out. So that is pretty much how it goes. And at the end, all the soil is stored in big barges because you have to make sure the quality, it's not more contaminated than when you put it back. So so another government agency does all the checks, they make samples of the contamination. And if they approve, the contractor put back all the soil and even it out of the whole area. So after the recovery is finished, they also work 1 week or 2 weeks to even out all the soil and to leave the place actually, in good shape behind.
That's hugely impressive, that recovery operation. And as I said earlier, it's important that we understand the complexity and the effort that's gone in. But the human side is probably the most important part of this, I think. And during the war, these families would have just got a telegram saying, your son, Flying Officer Smith, is missing, or your son, Flying Officer Smith, has been killed. And literally it was as blunt as that. And that would just be a telegram turning up. Part of that was because society then was less emotional, certainly in Britain. Part of it was just the sheer number of casualties coming through. And you compare that to casualty notification for the army today, where people are specially trained. They always have somebody turn up in person, usually with the padre, the religious officer that supports the regiment.
Yeah.
And they're all very well trained to deliver this appalling news to the relatives. I just wonder what your take on that side of it from the family's issue that you've been dealing with, Lilian.
Yeah, so because the aircraft was found in 2008, but it was mistakenly identified as a different aircraft. So we had been in contact with, say, the wrong families. So when we started the project in 2019, they found out it was probably the BK716. So the volunteer organization restarted the whole process of finding the families. So when they were finally found, they heard the first time that the aircraft was found, but it was also going to be recovered. So that was a huge impact on the family because we had a son of one of the airmen who had never known his father because his mother was pregnant when his father left. But there was also still a sister in her 90s and never heard of her brother again, other than knowing is missing. And she couldn't come over to the Netherlands due to her age, but I've been to Canada and I visited her. And I was really impressed because she said, I always was worried that they came down in Germany. And it was such a relief. They had been lying in the Netherlands where, she pictured all the beautiful flowers and everything in the water. And it was very reassuring for her just to know that. Mm-hmm. And it was even more impressive that they were going to be recovered and have a burial.
That comfort that lady got just from knowing that her brother was lying in a friendly nation's soil, that's quite touching, that, isn't it?
Yeah, I I never thought of that. I would have been, I knew, missing, but that she said, I'm so happy that he hasn't been lying behind any lines for all these years.
That's sad, isn't it?
Yeah. So that proves that answers are important.
Oh, absolutely.
And you need to know a little bit what happened. Yeah. So after the recovery is done, the identification takes place. So our Air Force takes the wreckage parts with them, which eventually will be divided on museums or heritage houses to have an exhibition. But our identification team takes all the personal belongings and all the human remains. And they're going to investigate it more in their lab. And a specialized team that have done that for years. And in the end, they draw up a report and send it to the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Center in Innsworth. And they organize the burial for the British crew, and this also with the Canadian. There's also sort of a similar organization in Canada that helps out with the Canadian families. But in the end, it's all organized by the JCCC in cooperation with the Commonwealth War Graves. So what they do with the identification, it's not DNA testing or anything. That isn't possible either because you have hundreds and hundreds of parts. So the method is called minimum number of individuals. So, for instance, if you would find 7 upper left arm bones, you would know we found everyone.
Oh, okay.
So it's like a big puzzle with all the wreckage parts to sort out and to make an estimate. We think we found this number of crew members, and that report goes to JCCC, who looks into it, and then in the end it leads to a burial with full military honors. And that was quite impressive. I'd never been to any military funeral, so it was the first time. But I thought it was impressive because after so many years, still the importance and with the families. And that's a bit of the end of the whole project. And the aircraft was found in 2008 by volunteers. That's called the Aircraft Recovery Group that we've worked with. And they are specialized volunteer group in finding missing airmen, doing research, but especially also in finding families, which is also very time-consuming. So I'm very happy with the group that they all do that in their own time, because as a government, we don't have time nor the capacity to do all that kind of work. So they're very, very important in the whole game of the aircraft recoveries. So the Aircraft Recovery Group found first family members in the UK, and there was a curator at the Bomber Command Museum in Canada who helped out to find Canadian relatives. And through all kinds of channels, it also came to the Durham Constabulary, where there was a police officer, and in his free time, he found different families too. So in the end, we found about 30 relatives.
That's significant.
So which was that was significant. And we weren't sure if they were going to come over to the Netherlands or not, because some... the sister, due to her age, wasn't possible, but her daughter did came with her husband. But also some people, it was their uncle. So perhaps you will feel differently, but they all wanted to come over. Well, the biggest challenge was the COVID, the travel restrictions. So no one could come over during the recovery because it was still very strict. And I think we postponed the commemoration ceremony like 3 times. And at the end, we had to set a date, which we did in October 2021, so a year after the recovery. And for some reason, we picked a very good time frame because the travel restrictions were lifted, because they'd been very, very strict. And so most families were able to come over. I thought about 23 or 24 came over for the commemoration. And the year after, they came over for the burial.
Oh, brilliant.
So the first time I met with the families in person, of course, we had contact by email or telephone. And what was funny that I started the project with just a few dots on the map, but the story came more to life when you seen the wreckage, when you went to the crash site, but especially the stories from the families that made it far more real. So I was very happy they were able to come in person and then we didn't have to do it in a digital way. So I was quite nervous when they came over the first time because I thought, well, we're trying to repay a debt. That's how we feel it, because they liberated us. And how much can you do to repay a life? You can't do anything.
Oh, you've done a huge amount there.
Yeah, but it always felt, is it enough for anything? So that I felt very strongly. But as soon as the families, we all gathered in a hotel, we had dinner, and it was like one big family, and everybody had all different kind of stories. An interesting thing is there were 2 families who had never met each other before, but were family from the same airmen and met for the first time in the Netherlands through the BK716 story. And so that's quite good. Yeah.
I don't know if you know, but do you know how bomber crews were selected? It's very British. You would think they would match people to characters, to trade skills. So basically what they did was whenever these guys all finished their training, they'd put them in a big hangar and say to them, sort yourself out. So a pilot would go, oh, I need a rear gunner. And he'd look round for a rear gunner. And all these guys just sort of formed crews by mistake in some respects. And that's how they did it. There was no specific way of putting them all together.
No. Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's quite interesting that the families have come together all these years later in a somewhat similar manner, isn't it? They've congregated around a central purpose, which was the great, fantastic military funeral.
Yeah, and one of the families, she had actually known her uncle. She was like 6 or 7 when when he died. But she said they're all looking down at us with the families. And because they were friends, we are friends too. And I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So that was the start, and they came over. So we had a commemoration ceremony where we unveiled a monument, which is in a park down in Almere, which is set up for commemorating resistance fighters. So we put a monument on a big field there, and it's a life-size pilot from the RAF made in bronze, and it's sitting on an engine block from the BK716. And the pilot is facing a tree, which is a descendant of the M. Frank tree.
Oh, nice.
From Amsterdam. So, and for Almere, it's been very important to have a monument because we were new land, so we have no World War history other than the aircrafts. So we now have a place to go. And it's also important because we have a huge number of veterans living in this area, that there's more a visible site where you can go or have a commemoration, stuff like that. So the families it was very, very emotional. We had one of our royals to unveil the artwork. It was a very big ceremony, which I'm very happy we made it work with all the COVID measures that was still in place. That was very difficult to organize, I can tell you. But we made it work. We also visited the crash site. So we had this big boat with all the families on it. And we had these white flowers, and everybody threw in one flower in the lake. And that was so lovely. And the year after, there was the burial. And they also came over. And I'm still in contact with some of the families, some more frequent than others. But they always send me pictures when they're in the Netherlands again, and they visit either the artwork or they visit the grave. So I'm happy that even it's not just at the commemoration or the burial, but even after that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that shows you the importance of what you and your team and the people of Holland and the Dutch government have done with this programme. It's absolutely fantastic.
I remember one of the family members, she thanked me at the end for the hospitality, but she also said to me, he has always been Uncle John who went to the war, and now he's Uncle John who went to the war, of whom I'm proud of.
Yeah.
So I thought the impact it has just to meet each other and share all these stories, and that you have some kind of closure is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy to live in a comfortable world. Well, it's getting less comfortable now, unfortunately. But you know, I mean, I think we forget at our peril, and we'll get onto that strand of thought later on about why the Dutch people think it's important. I visited Arnhem some years ago, and I was impressed by the immaculate cemeteries maintained by the Dutch people for the fallen of that battle. And BK716 has got its own website, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. And on there it states, "Some historic events should never be forgotten. They define us, remind us of who we are and what we stand for. Our modern values grew from them. Passing on these kinds of stories to next generations is essential. It gives us more understanding of our society today and helps us create a better future." Can you tell me a bit more about the Dutch World War II remembrance culture, the depth of honour you feel strongly about, and how you commemorate Allied liberators throughout the year?
Yeah, I think it's good to know that the Dutch didn't see the war coming. I mean, we were neutral in the First World War, and it was kind of an idea to do that same trick again in the Second World War, which is a bit difficult if the other side decides differently. So we weren't prepared, actually. We thought, okay, well, of course, we're going to be hit economically, but why should we be in a war? So when they invaded us, it was, for the average Dutch person, came out of nowhere. So within a few days, our government fled to London, together with our queen, where they governed in exile the rest of the war. Well, the rest of the Dutch was just in shock and didn't know what to do. And even though the Germans at the beginning, we say, forced us with a velvet glove, it turned out worse and worse over the years. So our freedom has been taken away for 5 years. So you were suddenly part of a sort of dictatorship, and before you had more democratic values where you lived through. So I think that's very, very important. And we didn't have any military to fight anymore. They were all captivated or executed. We relied on others to help us. And I think because we were liberated, my grandfather always said we were liberated by the Brits, Canadians and Americans. And we, also me, owe our freedom to them. we're able to speak freely now, live in a democratic world because of what they have done. And we should forever be grateful for that. So I think that is very important. And that's why we have a lot of commemorations. We have for the Dutch victims, I say the citizens and the military is on the 4th of May, where we at night have in every town in the Netherlands is a commemoration at 8 at night, and they have a 2-minute silence. So whether you attend, I think it's the same as the 11th of November. So if you attend the commemoration or not, there's always the 2-minute silence everywhere in the country. So that goes for public transport and buses, trains, they all stop. The shops close early. Restaurants who might be open turn down the music and have the 2-minute silence with all their guests. So that is very important. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you have a sort of reflection on the Second World War and every war that's been after that and conflict. So on the 5th of May is also a very important day. That's a happy day because we celebrate freedom. We celebrate liberation. And there are musical festivals in our country, different places. And a lot of young people attend more the music festivals, I must say, than the commemorations. And it's also about being free, being in democracy. What does it mean? And that's a joint cooperation of a lot of organizations, but also the MOD, because they fly the big artists to our ambassador for freedom with the helicopter team, flies all the artists through the different free concerts. So that's what we do for, let's say, the Dutch. And next to that, we pay tribute to our liberators. So the more famous ones are, for example, in September, we have Airborne Month. That's in the area of Arnhem and the surroundings to commemorate Market Garden and all other operations that took place there. So you have marches, you have commemorations, wreath laying, all kinds of kids' activities, but also a massive parachute drop. Over 100 of parachutists come down from different allied countries, from the military, to pay respect. And on Christmas Eve, on most of all the graves from the RAF, the Commonwealth graves, but also American graves, they put little candles on it. And we try to involve children as much as possible. So it's very pretty sight because it's all dark. And every grave has this candle on it to honor our liberators. Well, more famous for you guys is the Guy Gibson grave. We have also commemoration each year. And what you see that because we have so many crash sites, you see in our country, I don't know when you were here, if you ever seen it, we have all these crash poles where the little aircraft on top, and they have a sign, here came an aircraft down.
I didn't know that.
So they're all kind of... Oh, yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
No, if you now know, if you see it everywhere in the country. And like for BK716, we now have a yearly commemoration on the 3rd of March when they came down. And you see that throughout the country. So there are more local organized commemorations, but they always invite, if they know the families are invited, and usually some other Brits, VIPs, or anyone who likes to attend. So that's throughout the year, depending on the crash date, or is the special anniversary or anything.
It's interesting because we're living in strange times again with the war in Ukraine and people scared of Russia invading other parts of Europe. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how that culture from a country that's been invaded. Do you think that young people, so a lot of young people in this country now are saying, oh, we don't want to get involved in war, we don't want to fight. Is that the same sort of thing in your country as well? Or because of what happened to Holland in the Second World War, is that not the case?
I think it's a bit of the same. I mean, we do commemorate to honor our liberators, but we have the same message, this may never happen again. And in order to never happen again, you have to understand the past to make better decisions for the future. But the biggest challenge is the new generation. How are you going to involve them? Because it's been long, long ago. I mean, I have stories from my grandparents because they lived through the war, so they're first-hand stories, but that's going to disappear. So what you see in the Netherlands is sometimes a bit divided because we said, okay, we were a bit naive in the Second World War and see what happened to us. You know, nothing can happen, we just stay neutral. Well, sometimes you can't stay neutral. So that is also, I don't know if young people very much feel that way, but it is a sentiment that's definitely there, that we need to be prepared, more prepared. Of course, we're a smaller country, so we need to work with other countries, but it's important to see are we prepared or not? So I think that's important. And I think with like Liberation Day, where you have music and the bigger artists or influencers who say, okay, I'm going to be an ambassador of freedom. I'm going to talk about democratic values and what it means if it's taken away. You can involve younger people more. And I think especially this aircraft recovery program is very important because you bring the stories alive through the wreckage parts and through the family. So for children, like in primary school, if you see a wreckage part and you hear a story about it, you get more interested than if you have just on paper, okay, this is what happened. So that's what we're trying to do. But I think it's and we're also trying to see, how we're going to commemorate in the future, because now you invite all the veterans from the Second World War, but someday they're not going to be there anymore. And we definitely want to preserve that because it's an important part to just reflect on where are we, and especially with the events in the world today. I think it's more important for people to become independent thinkers and to realize it's not all black and white, and not all Germans were bad and not all Dutch were good, by far.
It's interesting you say that, because often British can get on a high horse about this, and I've had a few discussions with people about, do you think if Britain had been invaded by the Germans, we would have had people collaborating? Our Jewish population would have been shipped off to the concentration camps. People would have joined up to fight alongside the Germans. It's to sit and take that moral high ground is wrong, because every country that was invaded, their citizens behaved more or less in the same way, and Britain would have been no different. And I think we have to remember that as well.
Yeah, I think it's human. And the thing is, I mean, the war started in 1940, but actually it started years before, when seeds were planted in people's minds and ideas. There was a clear road for someone to rise up and to this. So that's why I think it's important to tell the story, to pass on the story, so people beforehand, before war even is in place, you might bring some change.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the ways you're trying to keep the story alive and get it to the younger generations is through a wonderful children's book that you sent to me. And it's written again by, and please excuse my murdering the Dutch language here, Ingrid van Ginkel, is that correct?
Yes.
That's very Dutch. And thankfully, the title is a bit easier for me to manage. It's called Knight of the Stirling, and it's a fantastic children's book, but it's just as good for adults, and you sent me a copy and I had a good read of it. And what I liked about it, it was very expansive. It wasn't jingoistic. It explained the context of the war. It explained it from all sides. It talked about the German night fighter, the British bomber crew, Dutch civilians, German civilians. So it encompassed the full spectrum of the war. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and your battle to get a wider distribution for it?
Yeah, well, we wanted to do some education material, because we like to educate people, and I think people learn in different ways. So that's why you have all kinds of means how you want to share stuff about the war. I mean, a podcast is one way, but a children's book is also important. They can use it at school. Children can use it themselves. And what was important to us, that it showed different perspectives. If you're living in Berlin, you have a whole different perspective on the war than if you get into a plane in Britain. That's just how it goes. And we think it's important for children to learn that. So I think he did a tremendous job, the writer. It's a very, very nice book. But we started quite small. We wanted to provide it to the schools here in the surroundings. So we had a Dutch book first made. But after that was finished and I shared about people, we have this children's book. I started to get all these kinds of requests. Oh, can we have the book? Is it in English available? So we had it translated a year after we first released it. But the book it's published, or published by the municipality. So that's a government agency. It's not a commercial book. So that makes it, in a legal way, more difficult to spread. We can't put it on Amazon or anything. So I'm looking into ways if we can still sell it through museums or organizations that have educational purpose, because then it would be closer to what we're aiming for as a government. But it's not very easy, because I have very much enthusiasm in Canada and in the UK and in the Netherlands. So there's all kinds of different legal complications. But I'm still working on that because I noticed that a lot of people are very excited about the book, and we never anticipated. And the weird thing is, maybe I'm a very naive person, but I always thought the way we looked at commemoration, what we're doing here, was known by the Brits. Because if I go to commemoration, there are always some Brits there. So I thought, okay, they have the similar idea about it. And I noticed during this project, there's a whole different commemoration culture too. So that was quite interesting and perhaps a bit naive.
That's a two-way thing though, Lilian, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to get you in the podcast, because I was really surprised at the measures the Dutch people are going to.
So the children's book I'm still working on. It's distributed in all the schools in our province. So they're working on it. And I got this lovely, lovely email from a girl who's 8. And she said she's going to give a sort of lecture at school about this book. And it was so important. And she wanted to know more about the artwork. But we're also look for other means. Like I said, everybody learns differently. Not everything has to go through school. There are a lot of other ways you can learn too. So we also made an e-magazine, which was a cooperation between students from 4 different countries who were involved with the quest. So Canada, UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, which was quite interesting, not just in making the whole e-magazine, but also the looks and the perspectives from different countries and younger people on the subject. And it eventually led to the website where you can read the e-magazine. They all came over to the Netherlands and handed it out to our minister. She came over to, unveil or uncover the e-magazine. There's also a documentary has been made. There is a fantastic Stirling aircraft project in the UK in the area of Peterborough. They're rebuilding a fuselage, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, from a Stirling, and they're doing that from scratch. There's not a real blueprint. And they use actually parts, if possible. So the parts of the BK716 have become part of that fuselage. And that's being built as a monument of the special air crew there. I've been researching. And in the end, I hope the monument will be finished with the parts in there. So you can also pay them a visit. It's very nice, I think. I've never been there. But maybe one day if I go to the UK, I'll be able to visit that. There is a Dutch museum that also has an exhibition called Fort Veldhuis. And what's interesting, because a lot of things we initiated as government in the first place, like the children's book and everything. So the spin-offs that come from it are more important actually than what we initiated. I mean, we have a job as a government to do that. But that people think, okay, but this is important. We want to do that ourselves. Like there is a school program in the Netherlands, but also there's one school in the UK. And that's organized by a few of the students who worked on the e-magazine. And it's on a primary school. And with children, they had a program from BK716. And one of the persons of the Stirling aircraft project volunteered to help out in the class to show them the wreckage part and tell the story. So you have all kinds of spin-offs, which are very important. And also with our monuments, our veterans wanted to do on the 30th of March, which is then the anniversary, want to do a sort of do day where they're going to clean the whole park with children, share a story about BK716, share a story what it means to be a veteran, and then at the end we have a commemoration. So that's all kinds of stuff that we're going to do, so people just learn about the story.
Oh, I think that's really great, because not only you creating memories of the crew, you're creating cultural memories across countries as well, and reinforcing those bonds between two countries. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. And the thought of those aircraft parts from the Stirling bomber going into that Stirling bomber project, that's amazing, because again, that keeps it alive, doesn't it? I'll need to visit that actually.
Yeah.
And I'll put all the links for the YouTube video and everything else in the show notes so people can access them directly. The moral aspect of area bombing and the deaths of civilians is always the elephant in the room when you're discussing the subject of Bomber Command. Winston Churchill was keen to distance himself post-war from Bomber Command veterans, and those veterans were refused a campaign medal. Even during the war, questions were being asked, and this is an extract by John Alexander in Church Life, published in February 2020. And it says, on February the 4th, 1944, a prominent Anglican bishop, George Kennedy Allen Bell of Chichester, addressed Britain's House of Lords. He deplored the devastation wrought by the Royal Air Force in nighttime raids on dozens of German cities. Bishop Bell warned that not just military and industrial targets, but museums, libraries, churches, hospitals, schools, and architectural monuments were being destroyed, indiscriminately, along with residential areas. While apartment blocks could be rebuilt, cultural treasures were being lost forever that would be needed for the Germans' cultural renewal after the war. Bell was neither a pacifist nor a sentimentalist. He had been a committed anti-Nazi since the early 1930s. He fully supported the Allied war against Hitler, even as his extensive ecumenical friendships with Germans, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, made him draw a crucial distinction between the Nazi regime and the German people. Bell understood that this policy violated the Christian just war traditions, non-combatant immunity and proportionality. He granted that unintended civilian casualties were inescapable in necessary raids against military targets, but the sheer extent of non-combatant suffering and death caused by area bombing was entirely out of proportion. Now, it's interesting because I lived in Germany in the mid-80s with the army, and I had a German girlfriend at the time, and we were in Dortmund. And Dortmund was one of the most, I think it was the second most heavily bombed city in Germany after Berlin. And I met her grandmother, who obviously, and her mother, who lived through that bombing. I was dying to ask about it, thought it was like that experience, but I was also embarrassed because no, it wasn't a guilt. It's just a hard thing to explain. I think embarrassed was about what we did to that city. And I don't know why, because we didn't start the war and all the rest of it. But I think that throws into light the mixed feelings about area bombing and what Bomber Command did. Do you ever get questioned about this as part of your project work? And I just wonder what your personal thoughts were.
Well, actually, I've never been questioned on that. But I think because the sentiment in the Netherlands, perhaps, especially, of course, in the war, it was an eye for an eye, I guess, because the Germans kind of changed the game by bombarding the cities like Rotterdam. We also lost Dutch people who were put to work in factories in Germany. Over, I believe, around 30,000 Dutch people died of the area bombing of the Allied for just being there. So, no, we have never discussed that. If I think about it, well, I think every innocent victim in a war is always one too many, whether it's on this side or the other side. And the people who decide to go to war are usually not the ones that suffer the most. And that's the sad part of it. And I think it's always good to re-question a policy and sometimes to reflect on something. It's important to be more on the side than if you are part of it. So I think that's crucial. What I personally never understand is that you don't back up the people who are going to carry out the first policy you came up with. I think you should always back them because that's the path you chose. And I think it's incredible that people say, and they volunteered to do this. And I think you should always respect that. And if at the end you say, okay, we should do things differently, or if in a new situation we won't do it like that again, that's all good. And I think that should always be open to discussion. But at least support the ones you sent out there because they're the ones who are in danger and not the ones that's sitting at home.
Yeah.
So that's my
I think that's an absolutely fantastic point. And increasingly over the last couple of decades, we've seen that happen again where British soldiers are sent into harm's way and don't possibly get the full backing of their political masters. That's another whole podcast in itself, Lilian, but I totally endorse what you say there. The long overdue memorial to the crews of Bomber Command was unveiled in Green Park, London by Her Majesty the Queen on 28th of June 2012. And it commemorates the 125,000 men who served, and in particular the 55,573 airmen who lost their lives. And I think that goes back to your point. These guys volunteered to do a difficult job, and to sit and judge them maybe 60, 70 years later is a difficult task. The memorial is situated between Green Park and Hyde Park Corner tube stations and is open to view at all times. And I've been to see it, and it's a truly impressive memorial. And if you ever get the chance, Lilian, you're in London, I would encourage you to go along and see it. One of the fundraisers of the memorial was Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees, and his contribution was noted on the BBC. I've included this because I think it sums up really my thoughts as well. So it goes, He really believed that those young men who'd gone to war doing their duty knew they had every chance of being killed in action. Mr. Gibb felt it was the duty of younger generations to fight for the recognition that those men were denied after the war because of political sensitivities over the extensive damage caused by the bombings of German cities. Although he remained committed to making music to the last, he also remained committed to the memorial and the humanity and sacrifice that it stood for. He was its most prominent celebrity cheerleader from the start, and I'm sure it will be a matter of great sadness for those involved that so many of the men who fought for it to be built will not see it being opened by the Queen in June. It is perhaps fitting that the man who gave us hits like Staying Alive will have made such a commitment to keeping the memories of others alive right at the heart of our capital city. And I think that's a sort of pretty fitting bookend to that conversation we have just had about the morality and everything else.
Yeah, I didn't know that, so that's very interesting. So if I get to London, then I'll
it's really good. It's basically it's in a open-sided sort of mausoleum type thing, and it's got a bomber crew, 7 bomber crew, and it's like they've just disembarked from the end of a mission, and they're all looking to the sky. And the idea of that is they're waiting for their friends to come back from the mission, and it's got. I can't remember. It's got stuff around the sides of the sort of the little mausoleum bit that's included in. It's a really moving and very fitting memorial. We've already alluded to this, but the Dutch people suffered terribly under the German occupation, and this reached its zenith in the hunger winter of 1944-45, which I only found out about 10 years ago. And this is when a German blockade cut off food and fuel shipments. Can you tell us how this affected your family and the role of Bomber Command in getting supplies to a starving population?
Yeah, it's interesting you say I've only found it out 10 years ago, because if we have war stories here, it's either about all the planes that flew over, the number of planes that come up, and always the hunger winter, because that's what's affected people the most, I guess. So when the market garden operation took place, the idea was to free the whole of the Netherlands, but only part was liberated. And that kind of part in the south had a very important coal mine. So the coals didn't get to the occupied part anymore. And the other thing is that our government, who were in London, made an announcement through the radio by BBC, Radio Orange, to the Dutch, and asked every staff member of the railway to go on strike. So trying to help the market garden operation for the military troops from the Germans, so they couldn't travel from one place to the other and couldn't bring the materials. So 30,000 staff members of the railway went on strike, which was extremely dangerous because it meant execution. So you couldn't go back. It was a once decision. But the Germans had everything back with their own trains and their own staff within a week. So they retaliated by cutting off food blockage. So the occupied part, which food wasn't abundant at that time either, didn't get any food supplies, nor did it coal, nor fuel, no oil. So it got very, very, very grim. And the winter, for some reason that year, came in early. So all the waterways were closed too. So there was no any form of transport other than on foot or on bicycle, but a lot of bicycles had been confiscated too through the war. So there was no food, no oil, no fuel, not anything. So it got more and more grim, not just because of the food shortage, but also because there was a lot of plundering and robbing and theft, because everybody was just desperate and dying to get food, of course. So I think in October that year, the Hunger March started, which was, it's a name for people who went from the big cities to the more rural areas to try to trade goods for food. The farmers still had little food, but they asked enormous prices, and money was of little to no value anymore. So it was all goods like jewelry, coats, shoes, everything like that. If you had done a hunger march, you would be killed by the Germans. So it was a very dangerous route to undertake, and it sometimes took 10 days to travel 300 kilometers, because you had to go on foot and you had to go in hiding. And a lot of women undertook that because there weren't a lot of men anymore, because there were big mass arrests by the Germans. And they gathered 50,000 men from Rotterdam, sorry, to go to Germany to put to work. So it was a terrible time. So my grandmother was 14 at the time. She had 2 brothers who were slightly older, and they tried to gather food everywhere. So she mostly ate tulip bulbs, because there was only what was left in barns, and they were supposed to go for export, but nothing functioned anymore. So they were very old tulip bulbs. And as she said, it was extremely bitter and very disgusting to eat, but it was all that was left. And my grandfather told the people also try to eat pets, like cats and dogs. And nobody wants to eat their own dog because that's like family. But they were willing to eat the neighbor's dog or from anyone else. So it was also dangerous times to go on the street just among the Dutch alone. And that's why I said earlier, it's not everyone is good.
Yeah.
On our side and everyone on German. That's just not the case. And I think when you are more desperate and in a dangerous situation, you might make different decisions than you would make if I'm just sitting here safe and sound. I think that's important to remember. So they had food stamps. So my great-grandmother, she had food stamps, but there wasn't a lot of food anymore. So she would get like soup with potato peelings or anything. That was all that was left. And I believe at some point the food stamps were only valuable for 240 calories per person, which is just nothing. So there was a huge catastrophe for the famine coming up. Through the whole hunger winter, about 20,000 people have died, and over 900,000 people were malnourished. And the whole occupied part was about 3.5 million people. So they expected to have a big catastrophe if nothing would happen. And so the beginning of the 1945, our government and our queen made a plea to the Allies to please do something, because we expect it's going to be huge and completely out of control. And that, of course, was very difficult, because how are you going to get all that food down there? And there wasn't a ceasefire or anything. So they tried to set up a sort of agreement with the Germans. They met at the town of Achterveld, also very Dutch word. So there was a representative from Roosevelt. There was this from the UK, the Air Commodore Geddes, I believe was his name, was there. And there was some, from the Russians. There was someone from the Dutch resistance. So they all gathered on the field to try to make an agreement. And the Canadians brought in the Germans, who were blindfolded, to come to the secret meeting. So it was very, very tough to get to an agreement. And at some point, the agreement wasn't signed yet. But the RAF decided, okay, we have a sort of worked it out that they may bring food through the air. And I think the RAF kind of stuck their neck out at that point, because there was no formal agreement. How are you going to know the Germans are going to follow up what they've said they will do? So that was also, I think, a risk for a lot of the pilots. So they set up Project Manna from the UK side, and later Project Chowhound, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, on the American side. And it was kind of volunteering for the pilots, because you needed to get 30 flights within the RAF and then you could get out. But the flights that were in the Project Manna weren't put on your chart as one of the 30 flights. So it was kind of extra. And it was also risk, or the Germans not going to shoot or anything. They needed to fly really, really low. So that was also very tricky to do so. But a lot of the RAF airmen luckily volunteered. And what I've understood, it's been a huge, huge operation. And let me see, I think it's about 11,000 ton of food has been dropped down through the air. So that's just massive. Yeah. So all the bombers were filled with that, and the pilots practiced with sandbags and everything to see if they're going to fly really low. They flew about 100 meters, 300 feet, which I think is quite
that's low.
Impressive.
That's low, especially with no modern navigation aids and things.
No, that's also, and I know that one of the pilots said, okay, because people were so happy when they dropped all the food, and people were cheering on the rooftops, even though they set out a message, please stay inside, because unlike you sometimes see in the films, it wasn't dropped by parachutes. It was just dropped down. So you don't want to be hit in the head with that. But despite that, people went on the rooftops, and they painted on "Thank you, Tommies, thank you, boys." Also in the tulip fields, because they were so happy, not just for the food, but also the hope they brought over that, okay, liberation might be close by. And I remember that one of the pilots that described it, that he was waving at the people because he could see them because they flew so low. And they were on top of the windmill, and he had to wave up because they were higher than the aircraft. So I think that just paints a really picture. And my grandparents, they were in the area of Amsterdam, so there was a lot of food shortage too. So all the stories about, raining food is very much known here. So I think that is a beautiful, and what I think is, it's a story I really like, is that the airmen were so touched about all the Dutch waving at them and thanking them, that some of them took their own food ration, which they had with them, like a chocolate bar, and they made a tiny little parachute and wrote on it for the children and dropped it down alongside with the other.
That's a great story, yeah. Sort of parallel story there. Whenever I've been away with the army, where it was Bosnia or Iraq, the soldiers would always give chocolate and stuff to the kids. It's just, I think it's because they're always the innocents in war, aren't they, regardless?
Yeah. But then you see that the war has many faces. There's very evil, horrible face, but also a very kind and everything. And sometimes these stories aren't told enough, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's just small gestures, but the hope that you give along with the chocolate bar.
Like humanity you refer to, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. Because when I started on this project, I went to my grandfather. He was still alive back then. I said, you told me about the aircraft, but I never realized the number of aircraft that came over. Weren't you scared with all the sounds? And he said, of course I was scared. And even if it came down, you didn't know if it's Allied or German or anything. But he said, most of all, there have been sounds of hope. Hope that we weren't forgotten. And we were still cared about. Someone cared about our freedom. So alongside with all the bombing and everything, they brought that in the morality. And I think that's very nice. And with Project Manna, I think there's so much solidarity because it was the RAF, but it was also the Australians, Polish people, British, Canadian, that all went on board of the Project Manna.
Yeah, and that's important because Bomber Command was many nationalities. It wasn't just English, Irish, Scots, Welsh. It was from all over the Commonwealth. There was Americans involved that flew with Bomber Command. Yeah, that's a really touching story. That and again, showing my ignorance here, when we're doing a few warm-up chats for the pod, you told me about the evacuation of Dutch children to the UK as well, which I didn't know about. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so back then, children who were malnourished or a bit ill were called little pale noses as a nickname. But we had quite a few after the hunger winter. So let's say when we're nearing the end of the war, some of the children were sent to more rural areas in the Netherlands because they were doing so poorly that they needed extra food and get away out of the cities. But as soon as the war ended, the program became bigger and over 30,000 children took part of that. And they were sent to different countries. So there was Denmark, Sweden, and to Britain. And I believe 9,300 children went to Britain. They went to Coventry, which was a sort of colony camp, if I refer to it. And what they offered was part of the children stayed there, and another part went to foster families. And they stayed there, so there were children who were malnourished or had a high anxiety because of all the events that had taken place. They were aged 8 to 14. And what's also important, weren't children from people who were a member of the Dutch fascist party, because that was seen as German. And everything German after the war was a bit of a no-go at that point. So the children went there, and then not just offered food, but it was also to give them some structure, to learn to go back to school, to play together. And meanwhile, the parents back home could try to rebuild, what needed to be rebuilt.
That's really interesting you say about structure there, because we talk about the impact of COVID on children's formative years. When you think there's a lot of Dutch children, who are maybe 2 or 3 years old when the Germans invaded, a lot of their major formative years would have been under occupation, living under very stressful circumstances. So, So an interesting parallel there, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely because, well, you didn't have enough food. So physically it was very tough, but also mentally because you were always in stress, and it got more and more grim. And especially in the hunger winter when people were plummeting and you couldn't trust your neighbors anymore. That is just a really awful situation, I think. And it defines you as a child.
Yeah. Were a lot of those memories suppressed post-war? You read a lot about the war where people said that happened in the war, just move on. But was it suppressed for a while, then sort of in the 60s and 70s it started coming out? Or how did it manifest itself, that whole history?
Yeah, I think at the beginning it was more, okay, we need to move on. What's done, it's done. I think we're fully focused on that. And if I look at my grandparents, they did spoke about the war, but not very often. It was, okay, it happened. It happened to us and we need to learn from it. That was also as an aspect. And I think in the 60s, 70s, you see more books and more films coming out. And especially in the 70s, it was more a bit of reflection. Okay, the Germans have did that, but it was all black and white. So that's what started a little bit. But yeah, and I know that some people who suffered severely don't feel very great about the Germans and didn't want to use German equipment and stuff like that, or even kitchen equipment. Anything German did not come in the house. So I think it's also different what you have experienced. If you've been in a concentration camp, like some of the resistance fighters have, yeah, you feel very differently. And I can imagine that too. So it takes a few generations to lose that impact. But if for the hunger winter, like my grandmother, I would never ever say in her presence, I'm starving.
Yeah.
Because I know as a child, it always led to a lecture about what it'd been like and how grateful you should be just to have food and everything. So, yeah.
That's really interesting because, you know, even growing up, and we never went through the hunger winter, but whenever I visited my grandfather and grandmothers, the British obviously had rationing during the war. You never left anything on your plate. You never complained about food. And we didn't go through the terrible deprivations of the hunger winter. So I think that wartime generation were very much moulded and scarred by their experiences, whatever those experiences were.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
So we talked about where you get more information on BK716, and I'll post all the links on the show notes and that.
Yeah.
But it's such a fantastic programme you've talked about there, Lilian. Is there any way that people can contribute to the programme, where financially, or is there any other way people can offer support?
I think, well, it's a government program, so there's not a donation or anything. But I think the contribution is most in passing on stories. It doesn't necessarily have to be the BK716. That more, I mean, it stands for something much bigger. And I think what the airman taught us, that freedom doesn't come free, and we must always be careful that we're going to save that. It's even valid today, even perhaps with all the events going on in the world, it's increasingly becoming more important. So to have an understanding, and it doesn't have to be an heroic action or anything courageous. It can be small, sincere gestures like commemorating them, sharing the stories, and try to keep an eye on that. There are multiple sides to tell the story because it has so many faces. And I had this quote, which I got from Hannah Arendt, the writer, German writer. It says, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not a convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people from whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist." And I think that is also valid in today's world.
How relevant is that today with the internet and all the lies that are flooding through Twitter and everything else? Sorry, I interrupt you there. That's a really pertinent quote for today. Are you able to help with any inquiries from the UK that relatives may have about missing aircraft or crew? Is there any sort of process people can get in touch with the Dutch government or municipalities or...
Yeah, what we're trying to do now, because we launched there were different kind of documentaries made, and now it's getting more known also abroad that we get more questions. It's not like there is a desk or anything on getting more information, but a lot of volunteer organizations work on that. And the group of students that made the e-magazine are also very much involved with the aircraft. So I would say if anyone has a question, let me know and I can see if we can find information. Because what I found out, especially through the e-magazine project, is that a lot of information is in local archives and you just need to know where to look. And it's not just one central archive where you can browse through it. So perhaps another country or another insights provide you more information than you already had. So yes, in that way I can help out. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's great. If it's all right with you, would you have an email address people could drop you a line at, and I could put that in the show notes? Would that be okay at some point?
Yeah, I will send you the email. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm quite excited now. We're going to have a first competition on the podcast.
Okay.
75 plus episodes and we haven't done it. And we're going to give 3 listeners the opportunity to win a book we discussed, Night of the Stirling, and even more for a British man, a chance to win a couple of beers as well, which are not just ordinary beers. Can you just describe the beers, please, Lilian?
Yeah, the beer are made by a local brewery here in Almere, and they made it especially in tribute of the BK716 Airmen, so it's completely dedicated to them. It's a limited edition, so they're actually the last ones available. So the book and the beer combination.
Very exciting, but we do have a couple of limitations in that we could only include it because of export issues to within Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so, because it's not possible to every country to send.
So unfortunately, it'll need to be just within the European area. So, great question you've got here. I know you sweated a little bit over this one, Lilian, so what is the question?
Yeah, I did. So BK716 was part of the 218 Squadron, the so-called Gold Coast Squadron. Which motto did this squadron have? Great
question. And the first 3 people that send the correct answer to my email, the unconventionalsoldier at gmail.com, and that's in the bottom of the show notes as well. Those first 3 people that land in successfully be awarded that fantastic prize from Lilian, and I'll be in touch to let people know how we'll get that wonderful prize to them. As usual, we'll finish off with Desert Island Dits, which is the guest choice of book, film and luxury item if they were marooned on a desert island. So what have you picked for us this podcast, Lilian?
Well, it's Dutch, so I picked a book that's called Luchtmeisjes by Ingrid van Chijs, but it's a true story. It's about 2 girls in the early 20s who came to work for a KLM, which is our Royal Airline. In 35, that was a new job, air hostess. Before that, it was only allowed for men to participate in airline kind of work. So it was still in its infancy. So people needed to pull out the aircraft. It was very dangerous to fly. There was no air cabin pressure, so they flew very low. And it was quite an adventurous life. And they both were very excited about the free life. And even though as a woman back then, you were not allowed to fly outside of Europe due to the danger, and your parents needed to sign that you could have the job. So that's just something. And if you got married, you were kicked out. So that's just a bit of the perspective. But when the war broke out, one of the girls became a member of the Dutch fascist party, wrote different kind of books of propaganda for the Germans. There was even a rumor that she had an affair with Rauter, which is a high SS in the Netherlands. And the other girl chose a whole different path and became a so-called England Voyager, as we call them. It's a Dutch name of honor for the people who fled to Allied country in order to fight against the Germans. And then when she finally came in London after a half year of getting all through Europe while walking through the Pyrenees and everything, she got in contact with Captain Arini, who ran the MI9. And he recruited her for room 900, which is one of the most secret service of the MI9, to set up an escape line for the Dutch in the Netherlands. So she was trained as a spy, dropped back in the Netherlands as a parachute. And then she was caught because she was part of the England spiel. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and counter-espionage. And unfortunately, she was taken to concentration camps. She survived. 54 of the spies were captured through the whole espionage effect. And only 4 survived, and she was one of them. So I thought it's an interesting book that people who live a bit of similar lives and have similar dreams of getting an air hostess and well, not being all like in a corset of a marriage, but want more free life, make such different decisions in life when the war comes closer. So that's why I picked it.
That's so. Has it been translated to English, do you know?
No, it isn't. when I read it, I think it should be a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like a fascinating story. And we did an episode on MI9 a couple of podcasts back, if anybody wants to have a look at that as well. So people might find that interesting. But that would make a great English translation. That sounds like a really interesting book. Film choice?
Yeah, that's also Dutch, sorry. Slag op de Schelde.
I'll never translate these.
No. Luckily, this is available on Netflix with an English title. It's called The Forgotten Battle, which is probably easier to pronounce. And it tells the story about a battle that took place, a very large battle in the south of the Netherlands, at the Scheldt, which is pretty close to Arnhem.
I've seen this film.
Antwerp, sorry. Yeah, you've seen that one? Yeah, so it tells the story about, a British pilot that comes down and the resistance, but also a Dutch person who come to fight for the Germans. So I think also a story that tells different sides.
Yeah, no, that is a really good film. That's a good pick. And luxury item?
Yeah, for some reason I felt a lot of pressure that it needs to be a brilliant answer. I don't know if your other guests have that same feeling too, like something really cool. But the first thing that came to mind was a watch. And I don't know exactly. I think it gives a kind of structure, or you can monitor something, or you can put it easy. I don't know, but that's what just came to mind.
See, to me, that's a very British choice, Lilian. I thought the Dutch were majorly relaxed. You know what I mean? Just wouldn't work to strict time restrictions. A watch seems a very British choice to me. But so I wholeheartedly support that one. My choice on this episode would be, if you could get it, the book we discussed earlier on about BK716. I know it's a children's book, but it's also pertinent to adults. It's got some great illustrations in it. So hopefully, if Lilian can get that distributed in the UK, nip out and get that. The other book I know you can get is the book that fired up my interest in Bomber Command in the first place. I read it back in the sort of the late 70s, and it's called Bomber by Len Deighton. And it's a very good book, and it not only does it discuss whole aspects of Bomber Command, it does something very similar to the book that Lilian's been distributing, in that it talks about it from the aircrew side, the family side, the German civilian side, and some of the old Allied side as well. So it's a really good all-encompassing book, and it's fiction, but it gives you a good overview of Bomber Command. That's it for another episode. Lilian, thank you very much for coming on. That was really educational. Really enjoyed it, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email, social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. If you download us from iTunes, like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there, or anywhere you get your podcast from. Thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.